Learned helplessness is a condition where a person, after experiencing repeated failures or uncontrollable events in their life, starts to believe that they have no control over their situation, even when they actually do have some control. And what happens in learned helplessness is that the person is left feeling powerless, passive, and defeated, like there's no hope. Our understanding of learned helplessness developed through a series of studies by the psychologist Martin Seligman in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Seligman and his colleague Stephen Meyer developed a series of experiments with dogs placed into three groups. The first group of dogs was the control group. These dogs were placed in harnesses but were not exposed to any electrical shocks. The second group was the escape group. These dogs were placed on a platform where they were subjected to electrical shocks, but they could stop these shocks by pressing a lever. In other words, they had some control over the situation. And the third group of dogs was the no-escape group. These dogs also received electrical shocks, but unlike the escape group, they had no control over whether the shocks would stop. No matter what the dogs did, the shocks would continue for a certain period of time. So that was the first phase of the experiment. Now, the second phase of the study involved the three groups of dogs being placed in a box. And the box had two sides to it, separated by a low barrier. Now, the dogs could avoid the electric shocks by jumping over the barrier to the other compartment when a light signaled that a shock was coming. So they would be in this box, a light would go off, and then a shock would follow the light. So what happened was that for the control and the escape groups, those dogs learned pretty quickly to jump over the barrier to avoid the shock when they saw the light. Because they had either experienced no shocks for the control group, or they had learned that they could do something to avoid the shock for the escape group. So both groups were able to be active and engaged and escape the shock when they saw the light go off. Now, the no-escape group, they behaved very differently. In the first phase of the study, they'd learned that nothing they did could stop the shocks. And so when they were placed in the box, they didn't even attempt to jump over the barrier, even though there was now something they could do to escape the shock. They simply laid down and passively accepted the pain. So what Seligman recognized was that the dogs in group 3, the no-escape dogs, they developed learned helplessness. They had learned during the first phase that their actions had no impact on the environment. And this experience led them to believe that they were powerless. So even when they had the opportunity to escape the shocks in the second phase of the study, they did nothing. So Seligman theorized that this learned helplessness phenomenon could explain similar behaviors in humans. People who experience repeated failures or setbacks or uncontrollable negative events, they can start to believe that nothing they do can make a difference. And this leads to a person being passive, resigned, and failing to do anything, even when there are solutions available. So relating this to depression, people with depression often display symptoms of learned helplessness when they feel incapable of improving their circumstances, even when they have power to make changes. And there are a couple of core features of learned helplessness. The first is passivity. People with learned helplessness tend to withdraw from challenges or opportunities because they believe their efforts won't make any difference at all. And people with learned helplessness often develop negative thought patterns. They may see failures as permanent. This will never get better. They see failures as pervasive. Everything in my life is terrible. And they see failures as personal, a part of their character. It's all my fault. So imagine someone who's been through a series of failed relationships, for example. They might start to believe that they're unlovable or that relationships just aren't meant to work out for them. And as a result, They may avoid dating, convinced that nothing they can do will change the inevitable outcome. And learned helplessness can affect all sorts of areas in a person's life. In work, someone who's faced repeated rejections for promotions may stop applying altogether for new opportunities because they believe they'll never succeed. And this just leads to missed potential opportunities to advance their career. In relationships, someone who's had failed relationships might start to avoid dating to prevent future failures, and this can just lead to worsening self-esteem, which reinforces negative beliefs and leads a person into one of those depression spirals I always talk about. Learned helplessness can affect a person's existing relationships. If I believe that my actions won't make any difference or I have no control in a relationship, I might avoid difficult conversations or avoid addressing problems in the relationship. And all this does is it leads to unresolved conflict, emotional distance, and an eventual breakdown in the relationship. You see this a lot in marriages where one partner feels like no matter what they do, they can't make their spouse happy, and so they stop trying. They stop trying to communicate or to engage with that partner. They withdraw emotionally, and this just leads to further dissatisfaction in the relationship. So learned helplessness can affect all sorts of areas in a person's life, which brings up the question of what can you do about it if you notice that you engage in patterns of behavior that seem like learned helplessness. Now, one of the most important steps in overcoming learned helplessness is recognizing and challenging the negative thoughts that drive it. Negative thinking patterns like, I'll never succeed, or I'm doomed to failure. These thought patterns need to be evaluated for how true they actually are. You can use thought records to examine these beliefs and look for evidence that contradicts these negative thought patterns and negative beliefs. So just because you failed at something several times, it doesn't mean you'll always fail. And how do you know that? Well, try to think about past successes or moments where your efforts actually led to things going well or positive changes actually happening. Another thing you can do is to break down tasks into smaller, more achievable steps. And in doing so, this can reduce feelings of helplessness by making tasks feel much more achievable. So for example, if you're looking for a job, instead of focusing on the outcome, which is to get hired, the idea is to focus on smaller steps, like, first of all, updating your resume, networking with contacts, or applying for just one job at a time. Each little successful goal will reinforce your belief that your actions can make a difference. It's also important to recognize and challenge negative assumptions that you might have about problems that arise in your life. So rather than avoiding challenges or problems, the idea is to use practical problem-solving techniques to actively engage with problems as opposed to avoiding them. Things like identifying the problem, brainstorming possible solutions, evaluating the pros and cons of the various solutions, and then implementing a plan to solve the problem. By approaching problem situations in a systematic problem-solving mindset, it can help give you a greater sense of autonomy and control in a situation. And finally, you can practice building your sense of resilience by focusing on a mindset of growth. Learned helplessness comes from seeing failures as permanent, but by focusing on potential growth and a growth mindset, this is the belief that your ability and your capacity to deal with things can improve with effort, and you do this by building resilience. So it's important to remind yourself that setbacks are a normal part of life and not a reflection of your self-worth. Every setback you experience in your life is an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to do better the next time. So while learned helplessness can have significant impact on a person's life, the good news is that it can be overcome by recognizing negative thought patterns, taking small behavioral steps, addressing problems head on, and building your resilience. And in doing so, you can break out of the cycle of learned helplessness and depression and gain a greater sense of control in your life. And if you want to learn more about tips to improve your problem-solving abilities, I'd encourage you to check out this video. So that's all for today's video. As always, thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I'll see you in the next one.